Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. You can support WitchLit and the serious book habit it requires at ko-fi.com/WitchLitPodcast. And you can be part of the show by sending in your own death, sex, religion, politics, money questions for our guests to victoria@witchlitpod.com. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and give us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help other witches find the show. Here's to never getting to the bottom of our to-be-read piles. Dr. Amy Hale is an Atlanta-based writer, curator, and critic. She has a PhD in folklore and mythology from UCLA and has published academic and popular articles on a wide range of topics such as paganism and the New Right, women's esoteric art, Cornish cultural nationalism, Arthuriana, color theory, and occult performance art. She has written widely on artist and occultist Ithell Colquhon, notably the biography Ithell Colquhon, Genius of the Fern-Loved Gully, and is currently editing a selection of Colquhon's esoteric essays. She's also the editor of Essays on Women in Western Esotericism, Beyond Seeresses and Sea Priestesses. She has contributed gallery texts and essays for a number of institutions, including Tate, Camden Art Center, Art UK, Arusha Galleries, Heavenly Records, and Spike Island, Bristol. Other essays can be found at her website, amyhale.me. Dr. Amy Hale, welcome to WitchLit.
Hi, Victoria. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, I am so excited to have you on. I mean, we had some scheduling stuff, so I'm glad it finally worked out and we got to meet, not Absolutely. In person, but at least virtually. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah. So our first question for everyone, and especially you as a researcher and a writer, I'm curious to see your answer to this, is why write?
You know, it's a very good question. I think that a lot of people would probably say because they can't not write, and I think that that hasn't always been true for me. I mean, I did a lot of poetry when I was younger, and you know, I guess that was kind of that would have been, I mean, much younger when I was like a kid, in fact, it's kind of a little known secret. I actually sort of minored in poetry writing in college, but it turned out that I wasn't very good at it. You know, I never got from it what I was hoping to get. And I never had really considered myself a writer. I've always, with my research, been interested in applied work, in seeing very tangible results, even with the kind of work that I do now. That was just always something that was of interest to me. So kind of in my younger days, policy and applied work were more of how I saw myself as a scholar rather than as a writer. However, especially with this Ithell Colquhon project, I found that there were things that I really wanted to say, and I know that sounds kind of very elementary to why somebody writes, but I have also found that I am enjoying language and playing with words a lot more now that I'm out of a strictly academic context. And so I write because I want to be read, because I love to play with words. I love the expression. And for me, it is, I have found that it actually has had more applications than maybe I would have thought earlier on in my career.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think about that, like, especially for researchers, that applied piece. I mean, because you do a lot of curation, you do a lot of other stuff too, but that's, you know, I'm sure there is writing involved in that too, because you've done some essays for exhibits and things like that too. Do you still feel that tug, or would you rather be writing when you're working on other stuff, or is it just kind of go together for you now?
Honestly, I really love writing now. I love it. I love it more than I ever have. And I think partially it's because when you are having to do a lot of academic writing and trained as an academic writer, for me, that process is, and it's not a bad thing at all. You're arguing a point. Most academic writing, whether it's essay or monograph length, you're making an argument, and you have to do so in a very formal, stylized way. What I'm appreciating now is that I'm still making arguments. I'm still building cases, yet I'm able to do it in a way that is more beautiful, more expressive, that paints a picture and tells a story in addition to making a case for something. And getting to do that is immensely satisfying for me. I really enjoy doing it. And I've also found now that people are asking me to do work writing about art, I get to think in ways that I never got to think when I was writing previously. I get to do fun descriptive stuff. I get to take myself on trips and tell stories that I never thought I would be able to do before. And yeah, I have really genuinely fallen in love with writing in a way that I hadn't expected to. My earlier forays into creative writing, especially when I was much younger, when I saw myself maybe locked more into the very specialized, frequently bite-sized practice of poetics. And I couldn't ever make that work, but lengthening out those ideas, taking it into an essay, doing something more creative, I feel like that's kind of my sweet spot. And I just love doing it.
Do you think there was like a moment or a time, or I guess even like a process of like that switch for you? Like when did you fall in love? Maybe is the question.
I think that it was when I made the transition. Well, when I decided that what I wanted to do with the Ithell Colquhon biography, her life is complicated. Her work is complicated. And I needed to decide how I wanted to structure that and how I wanted to tell that story. And I did something with it that was really rather complicated because I didn't do a very standard biography of telling a story at the beginning and then going to the end. I actually decided to structure that thematically, which for a kind of standard biographical reading experience had some challenges in doing that. But I felt like that kind of intertwining told her story in the way that I think worked best to demonstrate that kind of complexity. But in so doing, I chose to make this a more popular work rather than an academic work. So in putting this together, what I really had to do was think very strongly about storytelling, which a lot of academics aren't initially very good at, because it's something that we're not called to do, right? Because again, going back to that, we're building arguments. We're doing critical assessment. We're not telling stories. We're not hooking people. We're not necessarily engaging people. So trying to figure out how to take that really academic exercise and turn it into a story that was going to compel people. I wanted people to fall in love with Ithell Colquhon, warts and all. And that's still what I want people to do, is fall in love with this woman and with what she does. So to do that, it meant that I had to think about writing differently, which meant that I had to unlock certain things that I had locked down for like a good couple of decades. And in that process of unlocking that, I got to fall in love with stories. I'm not a fiction reader. I'm not a fiction writer, but I got to think about story, and I got to think about words and description and how to hook somebody in a very different context. And because I found a context that ended up working for me, it ended up being really compelling and exceptionally satisfying, and still wildly challenging.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we were talking a little bit before it, and so I had bought the book a few months ago. When I interviewed Zoe Hale for the show, she mentioned she chose her as one of her pantheon of sainted writers and painters. And I had never heard of her before. And so I bought your book and read it. It was like, oh, okay, it kind of dovetailed with another project I had going on that it might have also derailed. And, and then I reread it recently because we were going to talk. And I even thought about, like you said, the structure of the book even more, like the way that you braid kind of the themes in Colquhon's life into the book. And I think I'm trying to describe them as a reader, like with the experience. It's almost like the way that you chose to tell her story, instead of this purely linear biography, like you said, kind of a traditional biography. It's like you get this kind of foundational thing about her, and then the next piece. And then finally, when you get to the occultism and mysticism in the I guess fourth section, because there's in the third section, because there's a fourth section after that. It's like you understand her more because you understand all of these threads in her own life. Instead of just getting it in one chunk, you really distill it down to these themes in her life, which, yeah, I want people to go read it. And I too want people to fall in love with Colquhon and I think you've done a beautiful job of setting people up for that.
Thank you. Thank you. She's not always easy. I think in life and in the great beyond, she still poses challenges, but she is so worth celebrating and knowing about. And she's not the only person I write about. It's not the only writing I do, but at the same time, she is so present, and she's so present in so many of the concerns and movements that are just really very central to, I think, a lot of the concerns that we're facing. And so it really, I think it really is her time. And I know that I'm going to be writing about her for years. But, honestly, I still fall into Ithell Colquhon rabbit holes whenever I'm looking at her work. I have a huge personal database of images and writings, and I'm still trying to solve problems that I started trying to solve 15 years ago. So there are just endless themes and bits that I can write about regarding her life and her work. And now other people are too. So that's great.
Yeah. I mean, I think more perspectives, because her work is, her life's work was so complex. I think, bringing other perspectives into it can only tell us more eventually, right? But one of the things I was thinking about that is, like, in the different, and you mentioned that you write about other things, like you also write about color theory, you write about, some political stuff, you write about, like, Cornwall. So, like, how are those, you have a lot of threads in your life too. So how did you get interested in the things that you write about, and how did those braid together for you? I guess I'm asking you to write your biography in a question on a podcast, but.
Well, I've actually thought about this quite a bit, because if you're just looking at that list of things, it looks like a really disparate list of items.
I don't think it is, though.
Right? You see, it isn't. And it isn't. And so I have a PhD in folklore, and a lot of folklore and folkloristics has been concerned with questions of identity and meaning. This is kind of going way back, even to the sometimes very problematic origins and applications of the field of folklore. It's concerned with how we think about who we are and how we talk about who we are. And when I was a young woman, and in the 80s, interested in paganism, witchcraft, and all of the stuff around that, which is kind of steeped in this romantic Celticism and this bad but very compelling 19th century anthropology about sacred British stuff. I mean, I was all into that. And as I started pursuing that academically, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate, I had a lot of questions around not only what does it mean to talk about that which is Celtic, but what does it mean to people and how do they express it? Because it's not one answer. And so throughout my life, I've been unraveling sections of that in various contexts. So whether that is the context of pagan culture and spirituality, or sometimes very right-wing politics, or Cornish enthno-nationalism, which tends to actually be, actually very green and left-wing, or Arthuriana. Ithell Colquhon sat in the middle of all of these things. Mm-hmm. And that's why she became such a focus for a lot of the different strands of interest that I have been looking at for a lot of my life. She ended up being this fantastic case study. Mm-hmm. But really, I'm interested in, and this is still even some of the work that I'm doing now, because I'm doing a lot of writing on what I'm calling queer futurist esoteric feminism, or queer feminist esoteric futurism. That's it. Yes. Even that is concerned with how do we think about who we are, our condition, issues of agency, issues of relationality, break away from ideas of essentialism. Because in a lot of the earlier stuff, a lot of those identity issues are actually around problematic understandings of essentialism, whether that's race, culture, gender. And now having the opportunity to see how people talk about that when it's breaking down and how we rethink some of those problematic narratives. For me, all of those things are very tied in. They're very intertwined. And I think that they are foundational to both some of the problems and some of the solutions that we are looking at culturally today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thread of perennialism in talking about Ithell and kind of how she looked at the world, and I mean it shows up in a lot of other places too. I mean, I think about it like in I had a long stint in Unitarian Universalism, and there's definitely a perennialist thread there too in Universalism. But yeah, I think that conversation about how does this break down and what is the truth that we are really seeking. In some ways, like what is it about ourselves? Is it about the universe? Is it about, and I mean, that's, you can swim in that sea the rest of your life. Right.
Yeah. And it's a very rocky ocean, perennialism. I think that in the best light, it has a very noble underpinning to it. I think perennialism frequently means well. I think it has tried to do some lovely things. For many people, I find it to be a rather simplistic and very compelling narrative of how we can all spiritually get on the same page and how we can, we come from the same root and we're all going in the same direction. And it's a lovely thought. Unfortunately, it doesn't really express the diversity of not only the history of different types of spirituality, but also we don't all necessarily want the same endpoint. So trying to look at that in a way that is thoughtful, because it's still underneath so many different assumptions, certainly in even the pagan and esoteric world. Mm-hmm. Often you see it kind of rearing up in interfaith things and, in comparative religiosity, not really at the professional level, but certainly at the popular level. And there are a lot of people who believe in that there is still this one very simple truth, but how does that express itself? What are the problems with seeing things that way? So yeah, it's really a challenge.
Yeah. So you can skip this question if you don't want to answer, but Based on your interests and the time that you fell into this, I assume that you have your own beliefs and magical, perhaps practice, even.
I do.
But I also think about, like, I have had a lot of friends who, because I grew up, in the United States, in the South, so I had a lot of friends who went to seminary and kind of didn't really lose their faith, but really came away from it very changed. And so I kind of wonder, like, you've kind of had that experience as someone in the, pagan, magic, mysticism, occult, all the terminology, we can wrap that in. So I'm kind of curious if you've had a similar trajectory of, it sounds like, this is what I came into it with, and this is where this is how it started, this is how it is now, kind of thing.
Oh yeah. It's approaching things with a critical mind. It's a lifelong journey of doing and undoing and redoing what my spiritual approach to the world is. I was actually raised in a very atheist house, explicitly atheist, yet very thoughtful and knowledgeable and supportive of whatever spiritual path I wanted to tread. Yet there was always a lot of what I believed was very healthy interrogation about what it was that I was doing. I was asked to be thoughtfully interrogative of my own practice by my family. And what I mean by that isn't, what are you doing? It's, hey, just make sure that you're always thinking about what this means to you. So it wasn't like I had any kind of, transition from, say, Christianity or Judaism into paganism. I came at it from this really different angle. And it was actually that background which set me up well for being an academic anyway, and having that kind of persistent, but sometimes exhausting level of critique that I apply to everything I look at. So when it was the 80s and I was really steeped in a lot of that material, but didn't really have, I didn't really know how to look at it critically. It was a wonderfully immersive, magical time. It really was. And then as I started to kind of critique some of that and some of these underlying notions, not just of, what does it mean to be a Celt, but also some of the what I found to be uncomfortable gender politics, heteronormativity, especially around women's roles that I saw reinforced in paganism in the 80s, and particularly Wicca at that time. I said, I just kind of need to undo this and go in a very different direction. And so I went from being Wiccan identified to, in the early 90s, being like, okay, I'm a chaos magician. At my heart, I still am, although I'm also re-embracing Wicca at this point in my life within a really very different, wonderful framework. So yeah, there's been this whole process of dismantling some of the really beautiful and nurturing foundations of parts of my practice as part of my academic work. Mm-hmm. And I also really think it's very important for me methodologically, even though I don't have any problem, I'm very openly pagan, but I don't write from a theological voice. That's not my project. So I'm open about that, yet that's not what I'm doing mostly with my work. So, I've kind of gone through this process of critiquing and examining the foundations of what it is that I think that I'm doing with magic. But now, I kind of feel like I've been through that. That's great. So I decided to just kind of run off into the woods and be a witch now and be good with that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like I'm not critical, but that's not the center of who I am right now. I feel like I am very explicitly engaged in a project of rebuilding the avenues of enchantment in my own life and finding new ways and new paradigms to experience enchantment. I don't believe in the whole disenchantment narrative. I don't think that was a thing. I think it's always been there if you choose to find it. And that's what I'm working on right now. How can I see magic, joy, awe, and wonder in every moment that I possibly can? Because critique is exhausting. And so that's what I want to return to at this stage in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am unsurprised that you met Ithell that way. I mean, because the same thread. I mean, it sounds like, and one of the things I found most fascinating about her in relation to that is that she knew all these people. Like, this was her circle of, I mean, she was just steeped in that, earliest 20th century British mysticism and paganism. She was just in the middle of it with all the, like, tugging on every thread she could find.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yes, she was. She absolutely was. But when I think about the really good example of the kind of magical enchantment that I'm thinking of, and I know that, it sounds kind of like, fairies and toadstools. Great.
You're in the right place to talk about stuff like that.
Let's have more of those.
Yeah.
Love them. So Ithell was obviously really, really, really into color. She was into color, not just in her own practice, but also in the public applications of color. Maybe it's going back to this applied thing, but in order to make a difference, she wanted to see how color could be used to change consciousness, sometimes in very public ways. Maybe it was with design, maybe it was with murals, maybe it was with architecture. But that was certainly a huge thrust of her magical practice throughout her life. So in order to do that, she had very specific, not necessarily fixed views on color symbolism, color correspondences from a variety of traditions. Of course, she loved the Kabbalah, but she also used Sufi color schemes. And she even used a number of different Kabbalistic color schemes, some of which aren't particularly well known today. And what I think she was probably doing, and when I think about how she experienced the world, and how she experienced color. Can you imagine what it must have been like to have all of these different layers of meanings and symbolisms and experiences attached to the phenomenon of color? What does your world look like? Mm-hmm. If that is part of your encoding every day, what does your world look like? How do you experience the colors of the world if that's what you've been living? And I just think that must have been incredible. Yeah. I mean, I think to some degree she did that with shape too. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of enrichment that I think that you can get from choosing that kind of magical experience. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, I know. It seems to you like, I don't know, I am in my head a lot. And my struggle is to be more like in my body and like in the world. And honestly, like this, like I said, this ongoing project I have that has to do with color, that has been incredibly grounding to have like, I mean, I am not an academic in this field. I have an advanced degree, but this is not my area of expertise. But having read academic work about it, having read about Ithell's work and kind of this mystical realm and the Golden Dawn's use of color and some, I always feel a little weird touching Kabbalistic stuff, but it's so mixed in, it's hard to not touch it, like it's just part of it. But yeah, it's I kind of am like embracing the dichotomy of like, yes, this is an experiential thing. and I can also think about it in these academic ways at the same time. And I've kind of given myself permission to do that, I guess. I think I was always trying to separate those into separate buckets. So yeah, I'm kind of imagining like what her life in Cornwall was like, because I think about what I know of Cornwall. I've never visited, so I only know Cornwall from like books and movies. But I'm just imagining, like, of course she would have been drawn there. Like, it sounds like it would have been, you know, like almost like a sea of calm after London. Like, London must have been overwhelming if you're looking at the world through that lens of color, especially like at the time, because I mean, it's like this explosion, you know, she's kind of on the cusp of like this explosion of anodyne dye and like all of those things, except, and then you get to World War II and everything kind of turns navy and gray. But, it's just, I can't even imagine what that experience must have been like for her, thinking about the world in that way.
Yeah, I think we are so saturated with color and image that, even thinking of what life was like 50 years ago when, I was a small child, things were more muted. We kind of have the idea of, kind of muted Kodak photograph with really soft images. Well, I think a lot of life actually was kind of turned down because we didn't have the screens. And as we go further back, it reminds me of this. I think it was a sort of Calvin and Hobbes. I don't know if there's an iconic Calvin and Hobbes strip where his father is talking to him and saying, oh yes, actually the world really was black and white back in the 1940s. And it's kind of hilarious because, we know that it's not, but things certainly were more muted. Absolutely. So it's hard. I think it's hard to kind of go back and imagine what the surrounding environment would have been like with much more desaturated color and also with just not nearly the level of background noise that we have. Colquhon was a tireless campaigner for the Noise Abatement Society, which is still in existence. And in fact, she left a portion of her copyright estate to the Noise Abatement Society because she thought things were just too loud. And I get it. I don't think any of us actually know what real silence even approaches.
Yeah. No, I think about that a lot. Like just the overwhelm that we have all the time. Like light pollution, sound pollution, and it is pollution. It's just, I think we don't always address it that way. But
no, we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I live in an apartment building in Silicon Valley on a thoroughfare, and it is never silent, which makes recording a podcast really difficult. And I have to wear a mask at night because no matter what we put on the windows, it's so bright outside. Our apartment is never dark.
Yeah. That's I cannot really imagine, but would like to, what it would have been like even where I live now 100 years ago and how dark and quiet it would have been.
Yeah.
I would love to have that experience. I'm sure there are places in the world where I can still go get that.
I mean, I grew up in the country, and so it was, although we had this annoying street light, like a security light that I hated as a child, because it was, interfered with seeing the stars. But it was quiet. It did get actually quiet out there, like at night, and you could hear things. That the sound of night was something that I experienced as a child that I haven't experienced much as an adult. So I do think about that and seeking that sometimes,
Well, we live in the woods. We're lucky enough to live out here, and the night is loud. It's so the frogs and the cicadas during the summer, when they get going, it's like this amazing blanket of sound that starts around sunset, and it's wonderful. But I'm really looking forward, probably maybe 3 to 4 weeks away from getting it again, and it's not quiet, but it's still so, it's just like a wonderful little sound cocoon. I love it.
Yeah. I always think about, like, just because California's had weird weather the last few months, we've had some power cuts. And just the sound, how the sound changes when the power goes out in your house, like, is remarkable.
Yes.
Because you don't think about all the things that make sound in your house all the time.
Yep. All the hums, all the light buzzing. No, you're right. You're totally right. Ooh, yeah. I like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I might be fantasizing a little bit about her shack in Val.
Well, the thing, I do like to get across this thing about Ithell's shack and her anti-modernist sensibilities, which she definitely did. And she definitely hated the city. At the same time, she was technically a second homeowner because she, until 1959, when she was in West Cornwall permanently, she went back and forth between London and Cornwall. And she even says in the Living Stones that she never spent 2 consecutive seasons there. So when she got that place in Lamorna, there was a certain level, certainly, of privation that she aspired to in having some rather Spartan living. But she also, in the book, I made sure to put the architectural plans in there because I wanted people to see that this was, to some degree, a bit of an artifice for her. And it sort of also fit into this stereotype that people have of Cornwall as being, backward, rural, difficult to reach, marginal, which is something that Cornwall and the Cornish are still buffeting up against, and which hasn't always, frequently, is not great for Cornwall.
Yeah.
So it's been really important for me to bring all of those narratives in to try to tell a wider story about what it was that she was doing there and the kind of life that she was building, which does have a certain romanticism to it, even though there are certain things that I'm like, living right near the beach at Lamorna and having a lot of quiet and leaves surrounding me, that I'm down. I'm totally down. I think it's just really important to talk about the context of that, because I think that there's a tendency to want to attach a romanticism to it, that it's important. Well, going back to that critical eye, I think it's important to maybe have a little bit of a critical eye on that particular telling of her.
Yeah. No, and it makes sense to me too, because her, and you bring this up in the book too, that her life really became much more isolated. Like, she became more isolated as a person when she moved to Cornwall full time, where she'd had this more like in-person networking going on when she was in London for part of the year. And I think about that too. Like, I love London. I would love to spend more time there. It's, like, as much as I like the quiet, like, I also need to feed the well, and I can't just feed the well with cricket noise. That doesn't work for me. So I want it sometimes, but I can't do it all the time.
Yeah, I'm like that with certainly with cities and with London. We're really lucky. I live out in, again, 2 acres of woods here, but I'm 10 miles away from downtown Atlanta. So I'm not a city girl. I realized when I left Oakland, I'm just not. Never have been. And that's why I love living in Cornwall. I need vibrancy, but I'm not urban. However, when I go to London, I do love London.
Yeah.
I do love that nurtures me in a very specific way, for sure.
Yeah. I like access to it. What I have figured out as I've gotten older, because I've always said I hate suburbia, but it's where I end up living because capitalism. But yeah, like, I like to be out in the woods close to a major city. That's my ideal existence. Yep.
That's pretty much what we ended up doing. And it's It's worked for me fairly well. Yeah, there's still some questions about, because Ithell definitely was isolated when she moved there full time, yet her records show that she must have been going back and forth for ritual activity at least until some point in the mid 70s, which was quite late in her life. So she still had links there. There was still stuff that she was doing.
Yeah.
I think that still in that last decade, there were other types of isolation in her day-to-day life that were more challenging for her. It would be really interesting to have a much bigger picture of what her magical connections were during that stage in her life. How was she affording to get up to London or other places? Because, where she was living in Cornwall, it's not too far from the Penzance train station if you can get there, but it's not super easy. So it would be really interesting to know more about just the brass tacks of what her life looked like at that stage.
I don't know, you mentioned that, and I was thinking about this when I was reading the book, is that, so much of what we know about Colquhon's life, so much of what we know about a lot of early 20th century and further back is through their correspondence. And I think about that a lot now. Like, what are people going to do in the future that we all hope we have? I refuse to be completely pessimistic. When they start researching people from now, like what are the traces that are people going to have? Because we will not have, years of letters back and forth for the most part. Like, it's really, I think about that a lot.
It's super, super interesting because in a way, I look at what my, how many just bits of ephemeral correspondence are in my email. And when I look at somebody who had a rather staggering letter writing practice like Colquhon, and then I look at how many letters I effectively sent, before 10 o'clock this morning, the amount of correspondence that any of us generate is absolutely remarkable. But what happens to it? And it was really interesting talking to Adrienne Glue, who is one of the chief curators at the Tate, about the practices around digital archiving and how people are choosing to leave their digital archives and their email archives to places like the Tate. But then, can you imagine? Going through the boxes of Colquhon's stuff and what was there, because she there were receipts and all this stuff, which also helped piece together the story of a person's life. But can you imagine 50, 60, 100 times that, which is basically what any of us on any kind of email are generating? And what it must be like to archive that and make decisions about that and trying to piece together somebody's life. At the same time, it's also kind of scary to think about the fact that we've got so much data on how we're living right now, but it could all go poof.
Yeah.
It could, if something happened and all those stores were wiped out, what do we have unless somebody's actually printed it out? Yeah. Really interesting questions, but I'm glad there are professionals out there tackling some of these things.
Yeah. I mean, I just imagine somebody wading through all of my bookshop receipts.
Right? I know. It's,
Yeah. There's I think a lot of, email and correspondence is oh, she, ordered her groceries and, there's going to be a lot of, but there is a story to tell there. I mean, unfortunately, that isn't a story that we told for a long time. And I mean, I'm always fascinated when they do material studies of women's day books and things like those fascinate me. And just the things you can learn about the day-to-day life of just average people from their day planner or the book they keep in the kitchen or, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's
No, that stuff is really important. And I was having a conversation about the transfer of Colquhon's archive, which was when it was transferred from the National Trust over to the Tate in 2019. There are at least 5,000 pieces in there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, not all of them are stellar, right?
Yeah.
Because she kept all of her scraps. And, somebody was saying, well, maybe they could have thrown away the stuff that wasn't very good and just kept the really good stuff. Well, but what determines what is the good stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And it all depends on what questions you're asking, because sometimes those ephemera, those day books, those receipts, they give you really, really important information.
Mm-hmm.
And if you imagine what somebody might be like if they're trying to, say, piece together our lives today from 50, 100 years in the future. And I'm telling you what, I've done research with people from 50 years in the past where I've done interviews with them. Things get lost really quickly. Memories fade fast.
Mm-hmm.
So to think about somebody trying to rebuild what might have happened here within 50 years from now, if they were trying to do so, you need those receipts. Those receipts, that understanding of how we did things today, it's actually really critical. None of it's ephemeral. It just depends on what lens you've got turned on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, man, that is the rabbit hole that I could go down.
Right?
I have to sometimes prevent myself from going down certain rabbit holes because I'm like, though this might be productive for something way in the future, it is not productive right now. I think that must be I can't imagine being in, especially the first time you had contact with her papers, they weren't even cataloged, right?
They were not. No, it was absolutely remarkable. The Tate reading rooms, which are absolutely amazing today, there really wasn't much at the time, at least not where I went to look at this material. And they literally just wheeled it out on a trolley and said, have at it. They hadn't cataloged them at all. But then they started doing that sometime, I guess, around, I don't know, maybe 2001 was when they started actually building the catalog. And that took some years. And it's a fat catalog. It's several inches thick.
Yeah. And a lot of her stuff is in private hands too. I mean, they don't even have everything.
They do not. No. There was a lot of her material. There's a lot of her correspondence, a lot of her magical tools, magical experiments. Some of her, I think, some of her most pivotal correspondence was actually taken probably when she was in a nursing home or just prior to that, and has been kind of slowly sold on the market to private collectors. I have benefited from the incredible kindness of some people who have bought some of this material, sometimes not even sure why they felt the need to acquire it, but they kindly shared it with me, scanned it with me. It was still very, very important. And I'm very grateful to those folks who have done so. But there's a lot of it that, we don't know where it is. We don't know who has it. They haven't come forward.
Yeah. I mean, just from her published stuff, we know that she also had lots of juicy secrets on other people. So I can imagine there are things people would prefer not to come to light yet or ever.
There definitely is that. Yes, she did have a lot of juicy secrets, which is why when people have trouble with the Sword of Wisdom, and sometimes, which was her book on Mathers and the Golden Dawn, but also parts of her spiritual journey and some of her own magical material. The Sword of Wisdom is a really fascinating book. It's not just a Mathers biography or a Golden Dawn book. It's a whole bunch of cool, wacky stuff. And people have, researchers have given it a hard time, saying that it's, it's gossipy, or it's, some of these things can't be pinned down, it's not historical enough. I think I've read several different drafts of it, and I think there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there that, verified or not, frequently I'm willing to give her a pass.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, if nothing else, it's how she experienced it, right? I mean, it's her experience of it. Even if you can't academically, historically pin it down on a board, it's still her experience of the things that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is also exceptionally valuable. Sometimes it can be a challenge when she inserts herself into the narrative because she does that constantly. At the same time, that's also exceptionally valuable. So again, it depends on what questions you're asking of any particular text that you're looking at.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Gosh. Yeah. Well, so I feel like you and I could talk for hours and not ever get tired about it. But I also want to be respectful of, busy people's time. But one of the questions I'd like to ask people, and I have a couple more after this, but one of the ones I wanted to make sure we talk about is I think about, like, because you are working in this research space, kind of like you said, it's kind of still academic approach, but you're writing for a popular audience. Like, in making that shift in your work, I mean, what do you hope people take away from what you're doing now as a writer? Like, what do you hope that they walk away from your work with?
That is a really great question. Can I ask for clarification? Do you mean what they're taking away from what I'm doing as a writer, or from the content that I'm writing?
Which is more important to you? That's not a bit clarification. It's another question, but
yeah, right. So I think there are perhaps two stories to be told, and I'll start with my own position, my own shifting position as a writer, because I actually get this quite a bit. I moved out of an academic context. I taught for many years as mostly online adjunct. I embraced online education. I still think it's very valuable. Then I went into higher education consulting. And then I decided that I needed to finish this book on Ithell Colquhon. And from that, a very different career emerged that I had not actually expected as a writer and a speaker. So I get a lot of questions from people who are academics, who maybe they feel that that's not something that they want to be doing full time. They're burned out on teaching, because of course they are. And so I get a lot of questions about how that happened. And so in addressing my own position, from moving into being a full-time writer, I don't want people to have any illusions about that. And the way that happened was because we made a decision to really scale down and move to a much more sustainable environment, which allowed me to quit my job and be a full-time writer and still make enough money to sustain myself. So I don't want people to be under any illusion. At the same time, what happened in deciding to make that pivot was in deciding to write with an emphasis on accessibility. That to me has made all of the difference. And I really I understand that academics really have a lot of pressure to publish in very specific places. And most of those places are completely inaccessible. But I really want to encourage people to try to engage with a public audience and to try to have a voice that is accessible and interesting to a wider public. I think public engagement is so important for scholars in general. I feel very fortunate to be able to do this at this time in my life, but I believe that would bring a lot of academics a lot of personal satisfaction to know that they are engaging and to know that their work is being engaged with. So that's one takeaway that I would have. That's kind of part of my own personal story in there. I think in terms of my content, I think that's always going to be changing. I think it will always circle around questions of identity, who we are, how we talk about those things, how we perceive ourselves in the world. I think those will always be core features of what I write about. So I think that's always going to change. I'm always going to be telling different stories around those kinds of issues. I also, one of the things that I really want to do with my work, though, is promote the idea that gray areas and fuzzy boundaries are really the way that things work. Because in looking at, especially my roots in folkloristics and in folklore, originally a lot of that the folklore project was to try to put things in boxes. And that had, and sometimes that still does have some important ends. But I think that asking questions, to be able to sit in uncomfortable places, to look at the gray and fuzzy boundaries of things, that tends to be more how the world operates. And when we get more comfortable with that discomfort, I think that it will serve a number of greater purposes.
Oh. I feel like I should have that summarized and printed on a t-shirt about the gray and fuzzy areas.
You have it gray letters on a gray t-shirt. There you go.
There you go. No, but yeah, it's important. And I think that, the human desire to put labels on things, though sometimes those labels do some work that we need them to do, a lot of times they just don't work at all. So, yeah. Or the label we put on it is just wrong from the beginning. So,
and we're learning so much about that right now. I think it's actually a really exciting time with so many incredible questions to be asked, and it's not going to play out for a really long time. And I would love to, again, see how history looks at this period 200 years down the road.
Yeah, me too. I'm a little sad I'm not going to get to, but I'm also excited for the people who get to do that.
Hey, embrace your robot self.
Hey, that's right. Maybe singularity will happen before I shuffle off.
There we go.
So before we do our game of chance question at the end, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of, let people know where they can get you or plug anything you have coming up. I will tell you when this episode will air. So that will give you an idea of when to talk about. So this will air kind of toward the end of May. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Gosh. Yeah, because the next thing I have coming up is actually Monday, and I don't know what happens after May. So
just tell people where they can find you, and they can figure out what's going on.
Sure. So you can find me on most social media as Amy Hale 93. I am Amy Hale 93 on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm also on Facebook, although not too much. I am also the host and curator for the Last Tuesday Society. So you can find me hosting there if you're interested in a another really great program of online cultural events. I have a Medium page, which is also Amy Hale 93. And my website is amyhale.me.
What is ME?
It was a domain that I could get because there are too many other Amy Hale PhDs out there.
Yeah. I discovered that when I was trying to find your website.
I know.
I think I did amyhale.com and I was like, this is not her. So.
No, that is, if that's what I'm thinking of, decidedly not me. But if she gets my inquiries every once in a while, I'd love to know how she handles them because she's not forwarding them.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah. Thankfully, I was able to get my name, but it is Brashkey's a little less common. So it's a little easier to get.
There are so many Amy Hales out there. It's weird. And how many of us are writing in, a variety of areas dealing with religion, spirituality, even though some of us are very much not on the same page about that. Yeah. and also that we're writers. It's wild. I mean, it's kind of weird, but here we are. Plausible deniability. something goes wrong, I can always say it's one of the other ones.
Yeah. I will not plug him, but there is a Rashki writer who also writes in this space, but he wrote during the Satanic Panic on the side of those who were panicking. Let's put it that way. So,
oh, that's awkward and unfortunate.
Yeah, so I find it kind of amusing with a little bit.
Oh dear.
I don't even know if he's still alive. I probably shouldn't say too much, but yeah. So I was like, okay, well, clearly we're probably related because there's so few of us, but I don't know how. And
that's weird.
I'll just balance him out in the world. So
so odd.
So I'm gonna roll a die. Okay. And depending on what number I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. All those things that I love to talk about, and we love to talk about.
How fun! All right.
And then if I roll a 6, you get to pick what you want. And there are no rules to the game, so if you don't want the question, you can say pass. So,
okay, I think we'll be great.
5, money. Oh, interesting. So I was thinking about this when I was reading your book about Colquhon's cousin who introduced her to the Golden Dawn initially. And you say that like many magical, mystical people, like he was basically always skint.
Yeah.
And like it is a recurring theme. Do you have thoughts around why truth seekers can't seem to survive in capitalism? Or maybe not that. That's pretty, I mean, that's kind of snarky, but you know what I mean?
So here's the thing, right? I don't think it's always true.
Yeah. I mean, she's an example herself. I mean, Ithell's an example herself.
Well, so her finance, I mean, gosh, this is such a fascinating question. Do I have thoughts? Oh, hell yeah, I do. So, I'm writing about Ithell Colquhon's magical texts, and there is a particular very complicated magical experiment based on W.B. Yeats's book of Vision that I really need to unpack and write about because it's crazy. So, in it, she actually, it's really cool because we've got every step of the experiment and how she's doing this, how she is doing this really complicated spell work. And she's broken it down into 4 quadrants. And she's got her list of intentions, right? What she's asking for in this spell, right? So here's some of the things that she's looking for. Well, she wants to find, an excellent cook, and she's looking for a good driver and gardener. Also looking for somebody who is interested in sex and can have an erection regularly, But just looking at those 3 categories, that should give you some. I don't think that this was for her hey, I'd love to have a private chef. I think that this was part of the expectation of something that she would have. Mm-hmm. So she was privileged. The degree to which she was privileged and how that changed throughout her life is not entirely clear. But she was definitely privileged. And to look at kind of this idea of, contemporary, particularly pagan relationships with money. Yes, there are different values around what it means to have money, different values around how one engages with money, capitalism, entrepreneurialism, and magic. I don't think that it is such an overarching issue as it is sometimes made out to be. I think that there are perhaps some segments of the wider community that are not as, that are maybe don't have, how do I put this? There are a range of values around money making, and capitalism, and what our values should be around those. I think the idea that pagans won't pay for anything or that pagans can't pay for anything, I don't think that's always true, because I know pagans who can very easily, or would very easily, drop money on, like, a $300 costume or piece of jewelry or a talismanic book, but might not choose to make that investment elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it depends. There are just a range of attitudes in the community to it. And I don't think that there should be an overarching assumption that pagans or witches or magicians can't or won't make money, because there are people, I think, engaging in magical subcultures that exist at every range of values and experience around that.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean, I do think there is, like, in some traditions and some like ways of working, there does seem to be a lot of stuff around getting money to take care of life stuff, which I think makes sense. But like you said, I mean, there's also like multi-$1,000 trips to go to the sacred wells of Ireland, like these things exist on the same spectrum.
Absolutely. Now, I think there are, though, wider questions around maybe perhaps issues of community, mental health, issues of belonging, issues of trauma, and the ways in which those can be manipulated within magical subcultures, the kind of people who might have had a lot of trauma or difficulty, who are drawn to magical groups, to paganism. But then when we look at a wider scale, is that any different from any other religious community? I think that it's very easy for those of us within it to be able to look at some of the flaws and difficulties around what we recognize as problems within our own communities.
Mm-hmm.
For another good example is, sexual predation. Sexual predation happens in every religious community pretty much across the globe. So when I look at these things, it's like, well, are these actually pagan problems, or are they problems that actually connect paganism to other religious groups in ways that maybe we could be asking more interesting questions, instead of continually reinforcing the marginality of people who are involved in magic, pagan, and occult subcultures. Instead of continuously reinforcing that marginality, why don't we look at maybe how we're the same rather than how we're different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, exploitation, like financial exploitation, exists across,
absolutely,
I would say, every subculture to some extent.
Absolutely.
And caveat emptor is a thing across everything. Like,
absolutely,
both of those things exist in all spaces, not even just occult spaces or religious spaces. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of pagans want to and have felt like we're different. And I have just kind of retreated to the use of pagans, because that is a particular, I think, magical subculture, and one which I've been identified for most of my life.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking really in those terms. And I think there's a tendency for us to want to characterize ourselves as marginal, strange, different. Some of that comes just out of the experience of, feeling magic, right? But are we, is it true? Is it true? Is it serving us? Are we really that different? Is there actually a wider spread of diversity of thought and experience within our communities than we tend to want to recognize, because we're privileging certain narratives and stories over others?
Mm-hmm.
And for a number of years, I mean, I'm still technically on the steering committee, but I was the co-chair of the Pagan Studies unit at the American Academy of Religion. And I really felt that it was important in such a large and diverse organization to start really looking at some of those commonalities because I think that it teaches us a lot more about ourselves and our position if we can do that. And I think that it might even widen our horizons and our opportunities for creative discussion if we start thinking in terms of commonalities rather than going in and being like, hey, I know y'all think that we're weird. Maybe we're not that weird. Maybe we're just not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is I think you're right. We privilege this idea of unique and strangeness. And then it's like, but are we unique and strange in the same ways?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask and look at. Not even just world religious traditions and how they experience the wonder of the universe, but people who don't, atheists. I mean, my mother was an atheist until the day she died. And 3 days before she died, she was talking very cogently about how she was going to go back to the stars. And that for her was a central experience of the mysticism of the universe. Mm-hmm. That might sound weird to some. Other people are looking forward to seeing Jesus. Other people are looking forward to being returned to their magical family and finding them again in reincarnation. Maybe we're all just a little bit strange, and maybe we should just kind of use that to reach across the divide.
Yeah. No, I like it. I think that's a good place to end too. Oh, Amy, thank you so much for being on. This has been just absolutely lovely. And I can already feel all of the rabbits in my brain getting ready to go find other trails.
Victoria, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a really fun talk. Thanks for letting me just kind of go weird.
Hey, that's what we're here for. WitchLit is a production of Thousandfold Press. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shanekar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at witchlitpod. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.